Well, let's start with chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. We're going to look at the Japhetic or Japhetic races. Those are the descendants of Japheth. It says in verse 2, the sons of Japheth were. Let me read them to you. Because God, as He dealt with mankind, saw to it that the nations, the tribes, the races were dispersed over the globe. We find out how He did it in chapter 11 next time. But He confounded the human speech at Babel. He intended to force nations apart, hastening them to be distributed over the face of the planet. The table of nations starts with Japheth, and that's in verse 2. Very briefly, I'm only going to go over a few names, but this is what's fascinating. If we look just at this first one, this is, by the way, our ancestry. I'm talking about the major European immigrant blocks to America. Most of them date back to this Japhetic son, Japheth, of Noah. But this is what history records. Japheth is regarded as the father of many peoples in the Indo-European archives. You say, like who? Number one, the pagan Greeks perpetuated, his name is Iapetas. If you look at the Greek archives, who they feel their forefather was, they call him Iapetas. Well, you know why? It's because they don't pronounce the J. If you take Japheth and don't make the J hard, you have Apheth, and they just transliterate it into Iapetas. So the Greeks talk about this son of heaven and earth who became the father of many nations called Iapetas. Who better than Japheth, who stepped off the ark almost like from heaven, because he came from nowhere as far as they're concerned, and came to be their forefather. Also, in India, in the Vedas of India, it appears in Sanskrit as Prajapati. So the people of India feel that their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is this Japati guy. Interesting. Iapetos, or Japetos, of the Greeks, and Japati of the people of India. In the Romans, they perpetuate their father of their culture as Jew Pater. Now, what's that? Jupiter, king of the gods, came down from somewhere to earth and started the nations. They call him Jew Pater, Jupiter, or Japheth. Father Jove is another standardization, but finally they settled on Jupiter. Also, the Irish Celtic people, the early Britons, and other pagan European races trace their royal houses to Japheth himself. By the way, the city on the coast of Israel, the first stop for every Holy Land group that goes over there, is the town of Japheth, which they call Jaffa, after Japheth. Does it ring a bell? Jonah sailed from Joppa. Peter, Cornelius, the whole deal is in the town of Japheth. You see, all these people lived in a very small area. In fact, I'll share with you a little later what the Jews think, who they identify Melchizedek as. They consider Melchizedek from the Bible to be the oldest man on earth in his time, who was none other than Shem himself, living still in Jerusalem. Very interesting thought. Of course, can't be verified, but that's what they feel. And so, these pagans who have no knowledge, they don't even know about the book of Genesis, they all date their family trees back to Japhet, Japhet, Juphat, Jupiter, Japheth. They all go back there. Well, let's look at verse 2. It says that this Japheth guy had some sons. Who are the sons? Well, Genesis 10:2 tells us that the nations that descended from Japheth begin with Gomer. Gomer's descendants, history tells us, are identified with the Cimmerians. They first settled on the shores of the Caspian and the Black Seas. We know right where that is today. That's the area where they say that they found evidence of Noah's flood. Of course, the people that are looking for it don't believe it was a global flood. They don't believe it was a universal flood. They believe it was a local, something about the glaciers spilled over the Bosphorus and put 600 feet of water. But it's interesting for them to even think in a biblical way. But these people, these Gomer's descendants left the marks of their presence as they left that area and spread across Europe as far as the Atlantic. In the German records, you find listings of Gomer. They were later driven out by another family we're going to meet in just a second, the Elamites. And the prophet Ezekiel, during the time of the captivity, talks about them and calls them, living in northern reaches of Europe, he calls them the descendants of Gomer. So in 600 BC, when Ezekiel was writing, the 6th century BC, he was looking out and he saw these people he identified as the descendants of Gomer, the son of Japheth. That shows how close this is in history. These people also, the Gomer descendants, appear in the Assyrian records. If you remember, the Assyrians are the ones that camped outside of the city of Jerusalem, and the angel of the Lord came and killed 185,000 of them. You remember that story in Hezekiah and Isaiah and all that? These Assyrians bumped into these descendants of Gomer and called them the Gemaria, and they defeated them under King Esdrahan the Assyrian, and they wrote about it and all that and all. But here's where it gets interesting. The people of which are called the Ashkenazi. Do you know today when a Jewish person comes from Germany and goes to Israel, what do they call him? An Ashkenazi Jew. Ashkenazi is the name given to the descendants of Gomer. And that's what the Jews picked up on, and they called Germany Gomer, or Ashkenazi. So it's just a fascinating similarity, and we can go through Jeremiah and everything else. But the scriptures say that this Gomer, which the Jews today say is Germany, and they even name the people there descendants of Gomer, Ashkenazi. The Bible says those people in the end days are going to be unfriendly toward Israel. Well, if the 40s are any indication of what the Germans think of the Jews, I mean, they are very unfriendly, right? Hitler and the concentration camps. Number 2, look at the second one, Magog. Magog is in chapter 10, verse 2. Magog in history was a fierce and warlike people ruled over by princes who bore the royal appellation of Gog, which would be like Pharaoh or Caesar. Their descendants were the Scythians, and their territory, the Caucasus Mountains. Do you know anything about where the Caucasus are today? That's the former Soviet Union. We're talking about Russia. And the Scythians, by the way, from the north, from Russia, made their furthest south penetration and actually conquered part of Israel. In fact, to this day, on about the third day when you go to Israel, you go to this ancient city called Bet-Shean or Beth-Shan. And that's where the Scythians made their furthest south penetration. And so the Scythians were stopped at that city. And of course, that was part of the Decapolis in the New Testament in Christ's time. And so these Magogites, which today are identified with Russians, came all the way down to northern Israel, where they're going to come back. That's why Ezekiel saw them coming back. They had already come down in Ezekiel's time and were defeated just south of the Sea of Galilee in this town called Bet-Shean, but they receded back up into the mountains of the Caucasus. But prophetically, Ezekiel said, I see them coming back in the last days, which is a prophecy of Russia coming down, and he says they'll be terribly defeated on the mountains of Israel. Verse 2 has a third name, Madai. Madai, the third founding father listed, has descendants thought to be the Medes, as in the Medes and the Persians. And these people are linked always in history with the southwestern shore of the Caspian Sea. You notice I keep talking about Caspian Sea, Caspian Sea. In a minute I'm going to talk about that because the single largest discovery of oil and gas in recent history, worth trillions of dollars, was found right in that region. Isn't it significant that where God has said, my enemies of my chosen people Israel, the enemies of Israel from the north are going to be coming down from this Caucasus and this Caspian region. And those people have historically been very poor. If you know anything about the Russian history, they've been the rich nobles and the poor peasants. And they've, even today, the Russian army, the poor Kursk submarine that sank, blew itself up, or whatever happened, because they don't have enough money to even maintain their boats. Those people are sitting on trillions and trillions of dollars worth of hard goods in the recent discoveries in the last 2 years. Well, so Madai is the Medes, also in this area, the Caspian Sea, which would now be lined up with the Persian or the Iranian people of today. Number 4, we find him in verse 2. Javan became the father of the Greek peoples. He moved over across Turkey. Tubal found a home in northern Armenia. Again, this is just the archives of history. Today, that would be identified also northern Armenia. The Georgian people that live up in Armenia and all. I'm not talking about Armenians theologically, but Armenians over by Mount Ararat and up north of there. That's also Russia. Meshech, number 6, in verse 2. From history, we find that Meshech found, his descendants found their home in northern Armenia. Again, that would be the Russians. And this Tiras family is thought to have been an ancestor of the Thracians. These are people that moved over if you know the Thracians, they lived in the Taurus Mountains, and the Taurus Mountains are where Paul had to go when he's going on his second missionary journey. And it says that he went from Antioch, where the church was, where we read this morning about Barnabas and John Mark. He went up to Pisidian Antioch, it says in Acts. And Pisidian Antioch is the Taurus Mountains or the Thracian people. Okay, now look at verse 3. Having listed the 7 founding fathers, Moses now goes on to describe the 7 founding families of the European culture. In Genesis 10:3, the first named is Ashkenaz. Now this is the Gomer descendant. Jewish commentators believe his descendants are found in Germany. To this day, Jews from Germany and Central Europe are referred to as the Ashkenazis. Secondly, in verse 3, this Riphath family, he gave his name to the Riphathian mountains in the northern part of the Caspian Sea. And is it coincidental that perhaps the largest discovery ever found of gas and oil, worth trillions of dollars, is found in the same region? I mean, isn't God amazing how he's stacking the proverbial deck to make these people feel increasingly powerful and growing? There's going to be a growing anti-Semitism in the world. If you think the 40s was bad, the future will be worse. The 40s, at least there were a few places that the Jews could find refuge. In the end, there's no place they'll find refuge. So God opens his own refuge and protects the Jewish people, and we already have covered that. But that's part of the cards being stacked. Togarmah, also in verse 3, is generally identified with the Phrygians, the Cappadocians. Now you say, where did I hear that? Well, don't you remember Peter? To the elect scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. 1 Peter chapter 1, those first verses there. So those are the people that live in that area. The Togarmah people are the Phrygians, the Cappadocians, the Armenians, and of course that's up in northern Turkey. And isn't it interesting that right now the Turkish people have a defense agreement with Israel? I mean, the Turks and the Jews are united? Yes. I mean, they share technology, they share weaponry, they share joint military exercises. I mean, a Muslim nation, a secular Muslim nation, Turkey, is helping the Jewish state? Yes. And the Jews are falsely trusting in these alliances they're making. And someday, Turkey, Togarmah, will turn. And Israel will be humbled as they've shared some of their delicate technology with their own enemies. So Ezekiel 38 and 39 records the same crowd, the Togarmites, the Magogites, the Meshechites, the Tubalites, and the Gomerites, are all to be members of an anti-God alliance of the last day, and they're going to be fueled perhaps not by trying to get, I collect old prophecy books. In fact, I collect books. And I have all these old prophecy books, and I've loved to read them, how they conjure up it's going to happen. And for years, they couldn't figure out why anybody would march on Israel. And so they said, it's the Dead Sea. It's got so much fertilizer. Everybody's going to want to march. And I thought, fertilizer? Who wants to march in fertilizer, and get the Dead Sea salts? I don't think they're marching to get anything. I think they're going to have so much money they don't need to get the Dead Sea. If the Caspian region gets fully developed, and it doesn't matter whether the pipeline goes across Turkey or it goes down through the Arab country or the Muslim countries, it doesn't matter. The money's going to flow into that region, and they're going to get more and more very heady and more anti-Semitic and more Muslim-oriented, and they're going to say it's time to destroy that little speck that's sitting on our holy rock of, the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa, and all that stuff. And so they're just going to go down there, and that's going to show the conflict of Ezekiel 38 and 39. We'll look at verse 4. We've only gone through a few names. The sons of Javan come next. They begin with this Elisha guy. This is folks from the Peloponnesus. That's in the Greek. Tarshish, we know about from the Bible. That's where Jonah was headed. That's Spain today, way over there. Kittim is Cyprus from history. And Dodanim, it's not only a funny name, it's an obscure, we're not sure. But whoever the Dodanim are, Ezekiel sees them coming against Israel. Well, real quickly, let me just go into verses 6 and 7, and then we're going to have to go. But the table next turns from Japheth's line, and these nations, which come to power after the fall of Babylon, and by the way, the Japhetic, the descendants of Japheth, have controlled the world ever since Babylon. Babylon was a Hamitic, a descendant of Ham. The Babylonians are from Ham, the cursed. Remember, Canaan was cursed through Ham. Up until Babylon, Ham and his descendants were running the world. Babylon was a Hamitic empire. But after Babylon fell, Japheth has been the global rulers. If you look at it, it's the Western Asian and the Europeans who have basically run the world ever since Babylon was fallen. And I'm talking about the Persians, the Medes, the Greeks, the Romans, and now, of course, the Russian and the Europeans with America are the global leaders. All of them are descendants of Japheth, just as the Scriptures portrayed. Well, let me just quickly do the Hamitic races. In the early dawn of human history, the descendants of Ham were the most vigorous and aggressive people. They were the earliest empire builders. They controlled human destiny. They are listed, starting in verse 6, Cush. That's probably a family that settled on the Upper Nile. He is most generally identified with Ethiopia. Some of his descendants might have migrated to Arabia and Babylonia and India. And as I said, the Hamitic people spread out into other parts, but first they went south. Mizraim, also in verse 6, is the father of Egypt. The word is dual and embraces both Egypts. In fact, the original name for Egypt was Kem in history. This Phut founded the nation of Libya on the African coast, and then the last one named, where we'll pick up next time, is Canaan. There's something significant about Canaan. In fact, we'll see later that Genesis 15:16 says that God had a clock ticking on Canaan, because that's who he cursed. He cursed not Ham, but his son Canaan. And he cursed him for the sinful act of his father, but he cursed the Canaanites, and they lived it out. And we'll see that when we come back, and we'll see how Abraham fits in that.